know that most of what you've seen, read, or heard about Billy the Kid is untrue? My name is Gail Cooper. I'm a medical doctor and forensic psychiatrist. My specialty is murder case consultation for the defense. For 20 years, I've used my expertise to uncover the real Billy the Kid. Researching over 40,000 pages of archival documents and books, I've written the revisionist history. It's shocking, it's liberating, and I've written books demolishing the hoaxes, hijacking the history. My talks will share with you what I've found. Cover-ups, misinformation, and fakery, to use Old West lingo, will bite the dust. This talk exposes a Billy the Kid imposter named John Miller. The information is from my book, Billy the Kid's Pretender, John Miller. John Miller, an early 20th century Arizona rancher, put little effort into his Billy the Kid impersonation. He knew no Billy the Kid history beyond the outlaw reputation and being Pat Garrett's claimed victim. The only profit he sought was impressing his wife, adopted son, and acquaintances with his claim. It was a harmless gambit, lacking venality of other pretender hoaxes. He was just one of many old-timers spouting malarkey about Billy the Kid. John Miller would have been rightly forgotten, but in 1993, 56 years after his death, he got a hoaxing author named Helen Airy with her book, Whatever Happened to Billy the Kid. Since Airy exerted barely more effort than Miller, she created a hoaxlet when compared with major Billy the Kid history scams. But she did hide that Miller's 1850 birth made him almost a decade older than Billy Bonney, born in 1859. Miller was no kid. He would have been older than Billy's boss, John Tunstall, and Tunstall's ranch hands, who nicknamed him Kid. Possibly, Helen Airy was inspired by the big Brushy Bill Roberts imposter hoax, which became public in 1950 and got a book in 1955. She used its formula of an accidentally shot and covered up innocent victim, a denied coroner's jury report, and conspiracy theories explaining its fables. And her appetite may have been whetted by 1990's Young Guns 2, John Fusco's profitable Hollywood movie promoting Billy the Kid imposters by portraying Billy as surviving Pat Garrett's July 14, 1881 shooting. Helen Airy's effort became no blockbuster, but John Miller got a life after death anyway. 12 years after her book and 66 years after his death, Miller's corpse got caught up in a media circus. It was 2003's Billy the Kid case hoax, arguably the biggest historic forensic fraud ever perpetrated. Conducted by New Mexico's self-promoting governor, Bill Richardson, it was his possible pay-to-play for a major political donor. Using lawmen from 2 sheriff's departments, it was a real filed murder case against Pat Garrett for killing an innocent victim instead of Billy the Kid. Its scheme was to fake DNA matchings from supposed graves of the kid and his mother to declare Brushy Bill as Billy the Kid. After I blocked those sham exhumations in courts, the hoaxers sought any DNA to continue their bogus TV documentaries. That was John Miller's entrance because his state-run Arizona cemetery was the only one leaving its graves vulnerable to backhoeing for a publicity stunt. His 2005 illegal exhumation for the Billy the Kid case's fake DNA matching transformed him from having no connection to Billy the Kid history to becoming its ridiculous sideshow. For example, Miller claimed his mother was a Comanche, but the hoax intended matching his DNA with Billy's Irish mother's DNA to prove Miller was her son, Billy the Kid. After I stopped the Billy the Kid case hoax, some of its public official promulgators recycled it by pretending it had been their private investigation. Featured again was John Miller's bogus DNA matching. So imposter John Miller will keep reappearing in my upcoming talks as a Billy the Kid contender in spin-off hoaxes. Old-timer Billy the Kid imposters like John Miller gave themselves away by performing Billy with outlaw mythology, which real Billy had abhorred. Billy Bonney's fame started with that faked history. Even his moniker, Billy the Kid, was made up by his enemies for their outlaw murderer creation. The time was the 1870s, when New Mexico Territory was in the throes of grassroots uprisings against the land-grabbing political cabal of the Santa Fe Ring, the real outlaws covering up their villainy, discussed in talks 11 to 16 on the playlist. The lost Lincoln County War freedom fight made teenage Billy the people's hero. His gadfly role continued with his court testimonies and sought pardon bargain with Governor Lew Wallace. For elimination, he was captured by Sheriff Pat Garrett, aided by the Secret Service, and sentenced to hang. Escaping jail, he was killed by Garrett on July 14, 1881, in Fort Sumner. But the outlaw myth persisted, warping even modern history books. The John Miller hoax, like other imposter survival hoaxes, faced the impassable hurdle of profuse identifications of Billy Bonney's body. His July 15, 1881 coroner's jury report identified him as Garrett's shooting victim of the day before. Also, on the night of his killing, up to 200 townspeople who knew him held his wake in the town's carpenter's shop. Also, he was identified by the Maxwell family's Navajo servant, his friend Delavina. Also, his pal, A.P. Paco Anaya, wrote a memoir published posthumously in 1991 as I Buried Billy, about readying Billy's corpse for burial. The coroner's jury report was filed by its justice of the peace writer Alejandro Segura with William Breeden, District Attorney of the 1st Judicial District and Territorial Attorney General, who then helped Garrett collect his reward. The report itself was located in Breeden's files and copied in 1932 and again in 1951. It's discussed in Playlist Talks 36 to 38. Another impassable hurdle was primary documents establishing real Billy the Kid history and unknown to a pretender like John Miller. There were Billy's writings and legal testimonies covered in Playlist Talks 4 to 8. There were reports of presidential investigator Frank Warner Angel and Secret Service operative Azariah Wild. Importantly, Billy's sweetheart, Paulita Maxwell, for whom he risked death to return to Fort Sumner after his jailbreak, was unknown to John Miller. He featured his real wife, Isadora, as his Fort Sumner love. Also, John Miller seemed unaware of the Santa Fe Ring, though Helen Airy name-dropped it. Her likely source was a note by Maurice Garland Fulton in the 1927 edition of Pat Garrett's book, The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid. Fulton wrote, T.B. Catron was a powerful member of the clique of politicians and businessmen called in those days the Santa Fe Ring, which largely controlled the territory of New Mexico. John Miller's biography was zero match to Billy Bonney's, including having bad vision, was in his November 8, 1937 Prescott Evening Courier obituary as Man Raised by Indians Passes. On November 7th at 87, he died in the Prescott, Arizona Pioneers Home facility. He'd been admitted on March 14th. There he fell and broke his right hip, then developed fatal pneumonia. Excerpted, it stated, John Miller, who was adopted as an infant by an Indian tribe after one of his parents had been killed outright and the other burned to death as a sacrifice by the Indians, died at 6:30 p.m. Sunday in the Arizona Pioneers' home. He believed he was born in December 1850 at Fort Sill, which he said was in Texas. Miller did not know the date he entered this state of Arizona, but he believed it was a short time after the capture of Geronimo, which was September 4th, 1886. Though the Indians had meted his parents a most cruel death, he remembered them as always being kind to him. One time the Indians painted him all up for some sort of ceremonial dance, and some of the paint accidentally got into his eyes. It impaired his eyesight henceforth. Once, when he was away, the house caught fire and his wife was burned to death. Note that this is Isadora, whom he married in about 1886 and who died less than a year before his Pioneers' Home admission. The obituary continued. He had lived around Buckeye for a good many years. The incidents about his life came from information told those at the home. Close quote. John Miller, having concealed his Billy the Kid ruse, was buried in the facility's Arizona Pioneers Home Cemetery on November 8, 1937. Obviously, Helen Airy avoided John Miller's biography. Her ploy was relying on interviews of Miller's old-timer friends. They recollected that he, his wife, and his adopted Navajo son hinted that he was Billy the Kid. Helen Airy did venture into Billy the Kid history herself to pretend that it was in doubt. Key was John Miller's need for a survival death scene to be Billy, so she began her book with a tiny, sly version. She wrote, It was near midnight on July 14, 1881, when Sheriff Pat Garrett shot someone in Pete Maxwell's darkened bedroom. Why that someone was not Billy is missing, though later to John Miller is attributed a tale of Garrett's accidental killing of his similarly dressed Native American friend. Airy claimed the victim's identity was hidden. What made her think that? She fabricates a document writing, when he was asked to sign an affidavit that it was the kid he had shot, Garrett refused to sign. She also purposefully misleads, writing, McKinney and Poe accused Garrett of shooting the wrong man. This adds Deputy Kip McKinney to her distortion of Deputy John Poe's statement of his initial victim uncertainty in his 1933 book, The Death of Billy the Kid, which he explained by not knowing Billy. Airy wrote, All through the years since that night, there have been doubts that it really was Billy the Kid's body they buried. Why doubts? She stated that unnamed people claimed to see Billy after the death date. She objected to coroner's jurymen signing with an X, leaving out their illiteracy. She lied that the coroner's jury report, quote, was never officially filed as required by law, close quote, when it was actually filed with William Breeden, District Attorney of the First Judicial District, as it itself stated. She wrote that the corpse was seen by few people when it was abundantly identified. Her made-up witness list contained only Garrett and his deputies, immediate family members, there were none, and snidely added, supposedly members of the coroner's jury. She made up that, quote, years afterward there were warrants issued for the kid's arrest. Her puny conspiracy theory was that T.B. Catron, the Santa Fe Ring, and Lou Wallace, quote, wanted to see Miller dead, but no reason is given, and Wallace had actually left the territory before real Billy's killing. She concluded, unconvincingly, surely there was reason to wonder that Miller was Billy the Kid. Airy makes clear that John Miller's impersonation was a team effort with his wife Isadora, called by Airy a dark-eyed Mexican girl. To friends, Isadora claimed that John, as the Kid, had been shot some days before the shootout at Pete Maxwell's house, and she tended his wounds and hid him from so-called officers in her Fort Sumner house's mattress. Airy calls Isadora Charlie Bowdry's widow, though admitting the widow's name was Manuela. Airy was unaware that Manuela Bowdry left Fort Sumner after her husband's 1880 killing by Garrett. Airy stated that Miller married Isadora on August 8, 1881. But John Miller's researcher, Jim Johnson, in his 2006 book, Billy the Kid, his real name was ... stated that census reports show they married in 85 or 86. But why should anyone think John Miller was Billy the Kid? Airy claims similarities: blue eyes, prominent front teeth, and heavy eyebrows. Miller had the pretender's requisite small hands and thick wrists for shackle slipping, a trick he did for friends, saying Billy the Kid could do that. Note that shackle slipping was made up by Lou Wallace for his Outlaw Myth articles. Airy ridiculously added that Miller wore a hat, which he sewed himself to match Billy's from the famous tintype. But that tintype hat was likely the photographer's prop, since real Billy wore a sombrero. Airy added absurdly that Miller also had a bad temper and tended to point his rifle at people. John Miller himself would show friends 12 supposed bullet scars on his chest, though real Billy had just a thigh wound from Deputy Billy Matthews, acquired at the Regulators' ambush shooting of Sheriff William Brady. No thigh scar was in Miller's repertoire. To back physical identity necessitated by the tintype, Airy included photos of wax busts made by a helpful artist who was quoted, "I aged the sculpture of Billy the Kid to a man of about 60 years. In my opinion, John Miller and Billy the Kid were the same person." The sculptures demonstrate that by altering Billy and Miller, a resemblance can be faked. Airy hid that in 1989, the Lincoln County Heritage Trust did a photo comparison study headed by world-famous forensic anthropologist Clyde Snow. It found no match of the Billy the Kid tintype photo to John Miller or to Brushy Bill Roberts. Another of Airy's so-called proofs would have outraged real Billy, Miller's last shooting victim, cited to show him as a murderous fellow like the kid, was a Mexican worker. But real Billy's biculturalism was famous. Having presented nothing indicating that John Miller was Billy Bonney, Helen Airy proceeded to give her mangled version of the history without indication that John Miller claimed it. Everything was wrong. The Lincoln County War was a range war. Tunstall and McSween were called partners. The strife was mercantile competition, and the war was a 3-day battle with McSween's men besieging Sheriff Pepin's men in a building until Fort Stanton's Colonel Dudley forced them to flee, with Billy taking command. Unaware of Houston Chapman's murder or Billy's actual pardon bargain, Airy pretends he wrote to Governor Lew Wallace about wanting justice and volunteering to tell a court about Lincoln County troubles. Ignorant of what went wrong, Airy makes up that people got tired of thinking about the Lincoln County War, so nothing came of the testifying or the pardon. She has Billy tracked by Pat Garrett for rustling and having a ranch for stolen cattle in Las Portales. She lifted that fiction from December 22, 1880's The New York Sun Outlaw Myth article titled Outlaws of New Mexico, The Exploits of a Band Headed by a New York Youth, The Mountain Fastness of the Kid and His Followers, War Against a Gang of Cattle Thieves and Murderers. Airy mentions the Stinking Springs capture and Santa Fe jailing, with Billy writing to Wallace that he had letters going back 2 years that certain parties wanted to see, indicating that she'd seen text of real Billy's letter of March 2nd, 1881 to him. For the Messiah trials, Airy was unaware of the Andrew Buckshot Roberts case. For the William Brady trial, she made up that Judge Bristol was controlled by the so-called Brady crowd, unaware that he was a ringite. For Billy's jailbreak, she had a gun in the privy scenario, with Billy slipping a shackle to strike Bell and the shooting of Ollinger with his own shotgun. For the Fort Sumner death scene, she shockingly lifted the Brushy Bill hoax's tale of his being there as Billy at a dance. She calls the historical shooting Garrett's version. Airy makes no attempt to reconcile the death scene with Miller's claim of being shot days before the event, so his attackers and their motives in his fable remain a mystery. Airy continues with Miller's irrelevant life after the death scene. She opines that Miller lived his life in fear that Catron and the Santa Fe Ring were after him. Helen Airy then spent the rest of her 175-page book citing Miller's friends' recollections and padding them with details of their own irrelevant lives. Herman Tecklenburg was the oddest. He made up that he knew John Miller in Fort Sumner as Billy the Kid and was his most trusted friend. On August 9, 1944, Tecklenburg, then a janitor, but claiming to have been a cowpuncher and Indian hunter, gave an interview for the Gallup Independent to a Wesley Huff. It was titled, "Did Garrett kill Billy the Kid? Herman Tecklenburg says no. Billy lived on a ranch at Rama 35 years ago and visited him." Airy referenced this article. Tecklenburg was quoted, "They shot somebody over in Fort Sumner, but it wasn't Billy. He and his Mexican wife escaped over into Old Mexico. Later he was ranching down near Rama. They all knew of him down there as Billy the Kid, but never spoke of it for fear of getting him in trouble. Big shots made him out to be an outlaw because they couldn't handle him. Down at Ramah, he was known as John Miller. To back Tecklenburg, reporter Huff pretended there was doubt about the killing. He wondered why Poe and McKinney didn't shoot Billy as he approached the Maxwell house. The answer was that they didn't know Billy and thought he was a Maxwell worker. He wondered why Billy didn't shoot them first. The answer is that they were simply strangers and he wasn't expecting an ambush. Tecklenburg claimed he immigrated from Germany in 1869 at 14, became a cowpuncher, and then met Billy the Kid. John Miller's researcher, Jim Johnson, exposed Herman Tecklenburg. He was actually born in Germany on June 9, 1869, and arrived in the United States on June 5, 1884, 3 years after Billy Bonney's shooting. He was either delusional or a liar. Frank Berard Bert Creasy, Miller's ranch hand, was the only interviewee to present John Miller's version. It proved Miller's total ignorance and use of sources. For childhood, Miller lifted from Pat Garrett or Walter Noble Burns. Creasy relayed Miller's tale. In 1871, when he was 12 years old, a deputy sheriff apparently insulted Billy's mother, for which Billy promptly shot him and fled to the hills. Garrett's book, copied by Burns, made up that a local man insulted 12-year-old Billy's mother and a kind man stopped Billy from killing him. Then the kind man was attacked in a saloon and Billy fatally stabbed the attacker and fled. Creasy continued Miller's tale. Billy made his next appearance in Arizona 4 years later in 1875 when he killed another man in a gunfight and later had a shootout with 3 Indians and a white man over a dispute and a horse trading deal. He killed all 4. Then he appeared in New Mexico during the famous Cattle War of the West, where he was thrown into Lincoln Jail from which he escaped, killing his guard and a deputy sheriff. Creasy added that a $10,000 reward existed for Billy. Note that clueless Miller made up the Lincoln County War as a so-called Cattle War of the West, and the reward was for $500, not $10,000. Creasy dated the killing scene to 1880, not 1881. The make-believe tale revealed that Miller possibly thought it happened in Lincoln. It stated that, in the company of an Indian boy who looked like him, Miller went to Lincoln to visit his Mexican sweetheart. Hearing that a side of beef hung next door, the Indian went there to steal some meat. Creasy stated, Pat Garrett, who was the marshal of Lincoln at the time and a well-known bounty hunter, heard that Billy was in town and along with 2 of his deputies laid in waiting near the side of beef. When the Indian boy stepped up onto the veranda of the house, he was shot down by Pat Garrett, who had apparently mistaken him for Billy. Billy, that meant Miller, told me once that he and the Indian were dressed alike to confuse people. Pat Garrett was afraid of the reaction of townspeople and immediately buried the body, and he collected the $10,000 reward. Billy, meaning Miller, immediately left with a Mexican girl whom he later married. Creasy also revealed John Miller's post-shooting fables featuring his continued outlawry as Billy. So there's a 1902 Montana bank holdup with Miller shot in the chest, standing trial, and buying a pardon for $4,000. And Miller showed Creasy a supposed bullet scar on his chest from that holdup and gave him his 1880 Army Colt .45 revolver as Billy the Kid's gun. This malarkey yielded Helen Airy's conspiracy theorizing. She wrote, To date, American historians maintain Sheriff Pat Garrett killed Billy the Kid in Lincoln County, New Mexico. But according to Creasy's account, Garrett killed the wrong man, concealed the error, and collected the reward. For reasons unknown, historians in the United States failed to follow up the leads Frank Creasy furnished about John Miller's claim that he was Billy the Kid. Note that Airy, as historically oblivious as Miller and Creasy, also confused the shooting as in Lincoln instead of Fort Sumner. Airy added multiple friends' short reminiscences. Bill Crockett, speaking for Miller's adopted son Max Miller, his friend, stated, "I do believe John Miller was truly William Bonney, alias Billy the Kid. Max told me many times that Miller had told him about the Lincoln County War, and Pat Garrett, who Miller said was his good friend. Miller said there was a Mexican shot and buried in the coffin that was supposed to be the kid." Recall that John Miller had told Frank Creasy that the victim was his Indian friend dressed like him, and Pat Garrett was not real Billy's friend. Eugene Lamson said when he was a boy, his father knew John Miller in Rama, and Miller, quote, talked a lot about Billy the Kid, but never admitted he was Billy the Kid. Also, Lamson's father told him he knew Garrett. His Garrett told him he shot a Mexican youth in Pete Maxwell's house and told his friend Billy the Kid and Billy's girlfriend, quote, to pack up and leave Lincoln County forever. That proves Miller's friends also confused the shooting as in Lincoln County and also tried to insert themselves into the history. From this fakery, Helen Airy concluded laughably that when John Miller and his wife went to El Paso for supplies, they were actually socializing with their friend Pat Garrett. And Atheling Bond claimed Miller was Billy the Kid because Miller's wife, his adopted Navajo son, and the son's children, and Herman Tecklenburg told him so. He also recalled that Miller told stories of Billy the Kid's gunfights and would show his 12 chest scars. Bond claimed that Miller also told him that Pat Garrett, a bad shot, couldn't have shot the kid in the chest, so he would have had to shoot him in the back. Georgie Jackson knew the Millers as a child. She stated, "Miller was on the run with his wife. His mother was a Comanche Indian, and his father was a white man. He lived in Texas with his mother and the Comanche Indians until he was grown. Miller knew Billy the Kid and ran with him." Inexplicably, Helen Airy included this inadvertent demolition of John Miller as Billy the Kid. Blanche Lewis, as a child, was frightened by John Miller because he had many guns and, quote, told everyone he was Billy the Kid. This is the only imposter claim attributed to Miller himself. And Emma Teachin, one of Mormon Ernest Teachin's wives, in about 1883, was frightened by some rough men who came to the house. She hit one over the head with a bowl of butter. Another told her she'd hit Billy the Kid. To Airy, this was proof Billy the Kid was alive in 1883, was chivalrous to women, and was John Miller. Phyllis Bustamante was a neighbor of the Millers. As a child, she heard them talk about Billy the Kid. Airy stated this proved Miller was Billy. And Andrew Vanderwagen, a missionary, stated that John Miller decided not to steal his horse after attending his sermons. He concluded both that Miller was Billy the Kid and was, quote, not right in the head. Joe Connolly stated that Miller criticized Billy the Kid publications by saying he should know because he was there. He also told Connolly he'd been a horse thief. Helen Airy interjected that it was when Miller was in Lincoln County as Billy the Kid. A Carl Baxter stated that he believed John Miller knew Billy the Kid because Miller said a book about Billy was lying. Baxter said Miller had a revolver with, quote, 21 notches. Note that 21 was the fictional number of Billy the Kid's victims. An unnamed source added that Miller also knew John Chisholm and worked for the Chisholm brothers. To ignorant Airy, it was amazing that Miller knew that Chisholm had brothers, missing the point that real Billy never worked for them or Chisholm. Pretending her nonsense was proof, Helen Airy launched a little conspiracy theory that, quote, the testimonies that Billy the Kid had escaped death in Fort Sumner, she left out those that said Lincoln, were silenced because the myths surrounding Billy the Kid and Pat Garrett were too overwhelming. She fantasized that maybe Susan McSween, whom she calls the cattle queen of the Pecos, helped Miller escape New Mexico or got him money from John Tunstall's family. Without evidence, or even claiming John Miller said anything like her claim, Airy rhapsodized. John Miller in his youth was known throughout the world as the brave young man who was called Billy the Kid, who in a bloody war known as the Lincoln County War heroically took on the Santa Fe Ring conspiracy. And she bemoaned that people had made money from the story, but not John Miller, because he had to hide out from the ring. Airy's little afterward added meaningless hearsay claims by non-historical people. So a woman whose father lived near Fort Sumner in the early 1900s said a Mexican he worked for told him he saw Billy the Kid in bullfights in Mexico after the death date. Someone from Albuquerque was told by a man who died in 1935 and said he worked for Pete Maxwell that an Indian who died the night before the supposed shooting of Billy was buried as him. A man told his family that he was Billy the Kid's friend and helped bury the body, and it was not Billy's. A granddaughter of Sheriff William Brady told someone that someone told her that Garrett had not killed Billy, but had killed a, quote, wanderer to let Billy escape. And George Coe was claimed as not believing Billy was shot, though Coe would have had no way of knowing. For press of post-death sightings, Airy presented tabloid-like El Paso Times articles from the 1920s to the 1960s. For example, the Fort Sumner Billy the Kid grave is said to have been, quote, marked by a rude cross that was to prove to Billy's sister that he was still alive. Note that Billy had no sister, and he was dead. Airy ended whimsically. And so William Bonney, alias Billy the Kid, alias John Miller, alias the Old Man, alias Old Dad, died alone and was buried in the Arizona Pioneer Home Cemetery in Prescott. But John Miller won the last round. He was not hanged by the lackeys of the Santa Fe Ring. In fact, John Miller had no match whatsoever to Billy Bonney by his birth date, by his personal history, by his appearance, and by his total ignorance of Billy's life, and by his promoter, Helen Airy's failure to find any real evidence for his claim. His death on November 7th, 1937, should have buried his hoax-slit with his corpse in his fittingly unmarked grave. But as stated, he became an important pawn in later Billy the Kid history hoaxes. A real mystery remains. Why did John Miller want to be Billy the Kid? Possibly there was real tragedy behind his tales of murdered parents and abduction. His multi-scarred body pointed to a rough life, and anecdotes point to his instability, violence, and possible crimes. It could all seem grand if it marked him as the famous outlaw. Upcoming talks will revisit the strange urge of hoaxers and hoax hucksters to be recognized for something they merely made up. Next, we'll begin exposure of the most labor-intensive and long-lasting Billy the Kid imposter hoax, that of Oliver Pleasant Brushy Bill Roberts and his promoting authors.